In the summer of 1988, the town of Pine Hollow, South Dakota, was the kind of place where everyone still left their front doors unlocked. A single two-lane road ran through its center, lined with feed stores, a post office, and the diner where everyone gathered for coffee at sunrise. The wind swept easily across the flat plains, carrying the smell of freshly cut hay and rain that never seemed far away. On a warm July morning, 26-year-old Marion Blake parked her pale blue sedan outside the local elementary school. She worked there as an art teacher, guiding children through colors and paper shapes, helping them see beauty in small things. People knew her for her gentle laugh, and the way she always tied her dark hair with a silk ribbon that matched the season's flowers. That morning, she was preparing the art room for a summer workshop. Paint jars clinked softly as she stacked them on the table. The janitor later said she had waved goodbye just before noon, walking toward her car with a sketchbook under her arm. No one saw her again after that. The first hours didn't raise alarm. Marion lived alone in a small cottage near the edge of town, and it wasn't unusual for her to take afternoon drives to the nearby lakes where she often painted. But when she didn't show up that evening for dinner with her friend Ellen Porter, the worry began. Ellen called the cottage repeatedly. The phone rang unanswered. By midnight, Ellen drove to the house herself. The porch light was still on. Marion's car was gone, but her purse sat on the kitchen counter. A small vase of wildflowers stood by the window, their petals beginning to wilt. Ellen called the sheriff's office. Deputy Richard Cole arrived within 20 minutes. He walked through the quiet rooms, taking careful note of the scene. Nothing seemed out of place, no broken locks, no scattered belongings, no sign of panic. On the table lay Marion's sketchbook, open to a page showing the outline of the lake's shoreline. "She probably went painting," Ellen whispered, "but she'd never stay out this late." The deputy nodded and made a note. He promised to drive by the lakes first thing at sunrise. Morning came pale and gray. A thin mist clung to the fields as the search began. Deputies checked every back road leading to the water. The first lake, Elm Ridge, revealed nothing. The second, Clear Hollow, was quiet except for a pair of fishermen who said they hadn't seen any cars parked overnight. At the third lake, Prairie Bend, Deputy Cole noticed faint tire marks near a small turnout where painters sometimes set up their easels. The tracks led toward the trees and stopped abruptly near a patch of grass that sloped toward the water. There, hidden beneath cattails, lay Marion's blue sedan. The driver's door was slightly open. Inside, her art supplies were still neatly arranged in the passenger seat. Her keys hung from the ignition. The picnic basket she often carried was on the floor, still closed. But Marion was nowhere in sight. By noon, the quiet town was buzzing with concern. Sheriff Don Harris arrived on scene, his expression steady but heavy. He called in additional deputies, and volunteers from the community formed search lines that swept through the fields. The sheriff ordered the lake to be dragged. Divers entered the murky water, searching the shallow edges first, then moving slowly toward the deeper parts. For hours, they found nothing. Then, as the sun began to set, one diver surfaced holding a small object, a ribbon, deep violet, tangled in weeds. It was the kind Marion always wore. The sheriff placed it gently into an evidence bag. That night, Pine Hollow barely slept. Porch lights glowed through the darkness as neighbors whispered across fences and prayed for some sign of their missing teacher. 2 days later, searchers found something along an old trail less than half a mile from the lake. A paintbrush, the handle snapped in half. The bristles were still tinted with bright blue. For Sheriff Harris, it was enough to realize Marion might not have simply wandered off. The area was sealed off for a full investigation. Deputies combed every inch of the trail, marking the ground, collecting soil and photographing the smallest details. The state's crime lab in Pierre sent technicians to assist. They gathered fibers, leaves, and footprints, though much had already been disturbed by weather. Within days, the sheriff's office interviewed nearly everyone who had seen Marion in the days leading up to her disappearance. Coworkers described her as cheerful, focused on her summer art program. The janitor mentioned she had received a phone call earlier that morning, though he hadn't heard the voice on the other end. Phone records from the school's office line listed 3 calls, one to her friend Ellen, one to an art supplier, and one incoming from a payphone at a gas station 20 miles away. The sheriff made note of that last call. When investigators visited the gas station, the clerk remembered a man who had used the payphone that morning, tall, early 30s, with a denim jacket and a quiet manner. The clerk couldn't recall the exact time, but was certain it was before noon. "Didn't buy anything," the clerk said. "Just made the call and left." He didn't recognize the man as a local. The description was entered into the report, though in 1988, without security cameras or digital tracking, there was little else to trace. As summer turned to autumn, the case remained open. Deputies continued to search every few weeks, scanning fields, rivers, and abandoned barns. Flyers with Marion's photo stayed pinned across the county. But no new evidence surfaced. By the end of the year, the investigation slowed. The state lab confirmed that the ribbon and paintbrush were indeed Marion, but no fingerprints or additional clues were found. Rain and time had washed away much of what could have been useful. Still, the sheriff refused to close the file. "We're missing one piece," he told his deputies during a meeting that winter. "One small thing that connects all of this." He was right. For years, the file remained in the department's archive, reviewed annually but never solved. Deputies retired, new ones arrived, and the case became something of a legend in Pine Hollow, the mystery of the art teacher who vanished by the lake. In 2002, a new generation of investigators began revisiting old files across South Dakota. Among them was Detective Hannah Mercer, who had recently transferred from Sioux Falls. She was drawn to older cases, the ones with quiet details and unanswered threads. When she opened Marion's folder, she noticed the handwriting of Sheriff Harris in the margins, his careful notes preserved in pencil. She spent weeks reviewing every photograph, every witness statement. She returned to the trail where the car had been found and walked its length herself. The forest had grown denser since 1988, but the landmarks were still recognizable. She crouched near the old turnout where the sedan once rested. The ground was firm, the earth dry. She noticed a faint ridge of gravel leading toward a small clearing. When she followed it, she found pieces of an old wooden structure, remains of a dock that had collapsed decades earlier. It was there that she saw something half buried in soil, a small metal clasp. She lifted it carefully. It looked like part of a bracelet, the kind used to secure thin silver chains. The clasp was sent to the state lab for testing. The results showed trace amounts of skin cells, too faint for the technology available at the time to read. But Detective Mercer made a note in the file: possible breakthrough pending future DNA tools. The case stayed active in her hands. She re-interviewed Marion's sister, her friend Ellen, and several retired officers. The story stayed the same: a day of quiet routine, a phone call, and then absence. Ellen told her something she had never shared before. 2 days before she vanished, Ellen said, Marion mentioned someone who had been coming to her art classes lately. A new student. He said he was just interested in learning to paint landscapes. The sheriff back then had noted a male acquaintance in his summary but no name. Ellen searched her memory. "I think his first name was Paul," she said softly. "Paul something. He said he lived out near Miller's Road." Detective Mercer checked old county records. A Paul Denning had lived briefly on Miller's Road in 1988, renting a small cabin for only 3 months before moving away. He had never been interviewed. Mercer pulled his file. He had no criminal history, only old employment records as a seasonal contractor. She ran his name through the national database, still nothing. But she noted it in the case log as person of interest 1. By 2010, forensic science had changed completely. DNA testing now required only microscopic traces. Detective Mercer, now heading the cold case unit, submitted the old clasp once again for re-examination using new equipment. Weeks later, the lab confirmed they had extracted a viable profile, though partial. The sample was uploaded into CODIS, the National DNA Database. At that time, there was no match. But she wasn't discouraged. She continued to keep the case alive, contacting Marion's relatives, updating records, and preserving every scrap of evidence under the new chain of custody protocols. Then, in 2022, 34 years after Marion's disappearance, a message arrived from the state lab. A new automated comparison had flagged a possible connection. A recently entered DNA profile from a routine employment background check in neighboring Minnesota partially matched the old clasp sample. The name attached to that file, Paul Denning. Detective Mercer sat still for several seconds, staring at the screen. The same name Ellen had mentioned years before, now confirmed by science. She reopened the case file, placed the clasp photograph beside Marion's portrait and said quietly, "We finally have you." That discovery set off the final phase of the investigation, one that would take the story back to Pine Hollow, back to the lake, and toward the truth that had waited more than 3 decades to surface. By 1989, the once calm town of Chamberlain was shadowed by quiet tension. Each house along the Missouri River seemed to hold its breath whenever the evening news mentioned the name Mara Jensen. Her family still kept her photo near the kitchen window, her bright eyes reflecting hope that had not yet dimmed. Her mother, June, would trace her fingers across the glass every morning, whispering softly, "We'll find you, sweetheart." Detectives had chased every trail they could. They questioned river guides, hikers, and travelers who might have crossed the area that September night when Mara vanished. Some leads pointed nowhere. Others hinted at something hidden, something just beyond reach. In the early years, the sheriff's office worked around the clock. They combed through woodlands, sifted through riverbanks, and checked miles of farmland for signs of clothing or jewelry. Local volunteers brought food and lanterns as the community gathered nightly, forming long lines through the grasslands under the fatting sun. It was the kind of effort that showed how deeply people cared, even when hope was fragile. Among the volunteers was a young deputy named Caleb Morton. He was new to the force, still learning the rhythm of small-town investigations. But something about the Jensen case settled deep in his heart. He remembered Mara from high school. She was a few years younger, always smiling, always the first to lend notes to anyone struggling in class. Caleb visited June Jensen every few weeks, updating her on progress, though there often wasn't much to say. "We haven't stopped looking," he'd assure her gently, and she would nod, eyes tired but kind. As time went on, the town slowly returned to its routines. The riverboats began to move again, children rode bicycles along gravel roads, and new families moved into town. But to those who had lived through 1988, The silence around Mara's disappearance became a heavy, unspoken memory. Years turned to decades. By the mid-2000s, many of the original detectives had retired. New technology had changed the way investigations worked, but old files often stayed boxed away, waiting for fresh eyes. That was when Detective Nora Caldwell, a determined investigator from Pierre, came across Mara's case. She was reviewing unresolved disappearances across the state when she noticed something unusual in the Jensen file, a single photograph of a footprint impression taken near the riverbank. Nora requested the old evidence to be transferred to the state lab. When the package arrived, it contained a few sealed envelopes, faded photos, and a small paper bag labeled Riverbank Sample, September 1988. Inside was a fragment of fabric worn but carefully preserved. DNA testing was still limited when Mara disappeared, but by 2007, new methods allowed analysis from even the smallest fibers. Nora sent the fragment for re-examination. Weeks later, she received the report. The results confirmed that the fabric contained trace DNA from Mara herself, but also a partial male profile that didn't match anyone in the original suspect pool. Nora's instinct told her there was more to this story. She revisited every interview, rereading notes written in faded ink. One particular name caught her attention: Harold Keene, a local handyman who'd helped with construction near the river docks around the same time Mara went missing. He'd been questioned briefly in 1988 but cleared because of lack of evidence. She decided to track him down. When Nora found Harold, he was living quietly in a neighboring county, now in his late 50s. His house sat at the edge of a long dirt road surrounded by tall birch trees. He greeted her politely when she introduced herself. "It's been a long time since anyone asked about that case," he said with a faint smile. Nora asked a few simple questions about his work near the river, his memories of that night. His answers were calm, consistent, but something about the way he avoided eye contact made her note the detail carefully. After the visit, she requested a voluntary DNA sample, explaining that technology had advanced and could help rule him out completely. Harold agreed without hesitation. The sample went to the lab, and Nora waited. When the results came back 2 months later, the partial profile from the old fabric matched Harold Keene's DNA. The report was clear. Nora read it twice before leaning back in her chair, her heartbeat steady but quick. It wasn't proof of guilt, but it was the first direct link between Mara's disappearance and a living person. She reopened the entire investigation. The sheriff's office in Chamberlain was notified, and the team began piecing together the events once again. Old evidence boxes were unpacked. Witness statements were digitized. Nora visited the riverbank herself that autumn. Standing by the slow-moving water, she imagined Mara's last evening, the wind, the distant lights from the dock, the faint sound of crickets. For a moment, it felt as though the air itself remembered her. Back in town, whispers began to spread. People who had long avoided the topic started talking again. Neighbors compared memories, old photos surfaced, and soon, even those who had moved away wrote letters offering to help. Nora met with Caleb Morton, now retired. He had kept his own notebook from those early days. Inside were rough sketches, hand-drawn maps, and names of people he'd spoken to. Together, they retraced the possible paths Mara might have taken that night. A new forensic analyst, Dr. Leila Morrison, joined the case to assist with DNA comparisons. Using modern sequencing technology, she analyzed all remaining samples, including dust from Mara's preserved clothing and microscopic residue found near the edges of the torn fabric. One late evening in the lab, Leila called Nora with her findings. "I think I found something you'll want to see," she said softly. When Nora arrived, Leela pointed at the digital monitor. A clear DNA link connected Harold Keene not only to the fabric, but also to a hair strand collected from Mara's bracelet, something investigators hadn't been able to test before. That discovery shifted everything. The next week, detectives brought Harold in for questioning again. The conversation was calm, professional, almost quiet. When Nora presented the evidence, Harold's hands trembled slightly, his voice low. "That was so long ago," he said slowly. "You really think you can still find the truth after all this time?" Nora didn't respond immediately. She looked at him and said, "Yes, I do." The next day, the district attorney reviewed the evidence. While the DNA connection was partial, it was supported by consistent circumstantial details, Harold's proximity, timeline, and objects linking him to the site. A new warrant was issued for further searches. Detectives revisited Harold's property. In a small storage shed, they found a box of personal items from the late 1980s, including tools, old receipts, and a silver pendant, engraved with the letter M. When the pendant was shown to June Jensen, she held it in her hands and said softly, "That was Mara's." The emotional weight of that moment was indescribable. For June, years of waiting had finally brought a sign that her daughter's memory still spoke through time. For Nora, it was confirmation that the case she had reopened was moving toward long-awaited clarity. By winter 2022, the collected evidence was ready for submission. The state attorney's office worked carefully, ensuring that every step was by the book. The story began appearing on local news broadcasts, reporters revisiting Chamberlain, capturing the quiet strength of a town that had never given up. As the snow fell over the river that year, Nora stood once again near the dock, feeling the same wind that had once carried Mara's laughter across the water. This time, though, the air felt different, lighter, as if the truth was almost ready to emerge completely. And soon it did. The DNA analysis results from the final sample were due the following week. Everyone involved, detectives, scientists, and family members, waited with patience and calm hope. When the report finally arrived, it contained a single line that changed everything. The message came in early one morning in January 2023. The sun had just begun to rise over the frozen fields of central South Dakota when Detective Nora Caldwell's phone buzzed on her desk. It was from the state laboratory. She opened the email slowly, almost afraid to breathe. The report was short, precise, and clear. The new DNA sequencing from the preserved pendant had returned a full match to Harold Keene. The chain had not just been handled by him. It carried microscopic traces from his workshop and the same chemical residue found on the old tool set seized from his shed. For Nora, it was the moment everything aligned. The years of analysis, the tireless revisiting of old notes, the endless waiting by the Jensen family, all of it pointed to this single truth. By afternoon, the Chamberlain Sheriff's Department moved quietly into position. Detectives coordinated with the state attorney, and an arrest warrant was signed. Harold Keene was taken into custody at his home without resistance. He spoke little as he was escorted to the car, eyes lowered, his voice calm and slow. The news spread through town almost instantly. In the diner near Main Street, where June Jensen often stopped for morning coffee, a neighbor approached her gently. "They've made an arrest," she said softly. June paused, her cup halfway to her lips. For a moment she said nothing, just closed her eyes as if silently thanking the air around her. Reporters began gathering near the courthouse the next day. They spoke of how the case that had haunted Chamberlain for 35 years had finally reached its turning point. The community, once uncertain, now watched with quiet reflection. Detective Nora Caldwell sat across from Harold during the recorded interview that evening. The room was simple, a single table and 2 chairs. She placed a folder of documents in front of him. "Mr. Keene," she said in her calm, steady voice, "the evidence collected connects you to items belonging to Mara Jensen. You were present near the riverbank that night." He looked at the folder, then at Nora. "It's been a long time," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied, "but time doesn't erase the truth." He didn't respond again. The next week, the district attorney's office formally charged him. The courtroom filled with familiar faces, teachers who had known Mara, childhood friends, townspeople who had carried her memory for decades. June Jensen sat near the front, hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady but soft. As the trial began, the prosecution laid out the timeline carefully. The re-examined evidence told a clear, detailed story: the recovered fabric, the pendant, and the DNA link that science had finally made visible. The defense presented their side calmly, emphasizing the long years and uncertain memories. But every time Mara's name was mentioned, there was a collective stillness in the room. Dr. Leela Morrison testified about the advanced sequencing process. She explained how trace samples can survive for decades if preserved properly, and how new technology can identify profiles once thought impossible to detect. Her testimony was clear, professional, and deeply human. "It's remarkable what time can reveal," she said. Detective Nora Caldwell took the stand next. Her voice remained even, but those listening could sense the emotion behind her words. She described reopening the case, revisiting old evidence, and the moment the DNA report arrived. She didn't speak dramatically, just honestly. "I believed this case still held answers," she said. "I just needed to listen closely enough to hear them." When June Jensen testified, the room was silent. She didn't speak long. She simply described her daughter, the laughter, the warmth, the way Mara always believed that kindness mattered. She ended with, "I never lost faith that one day we'd understand what really happened." In the weeks that followed, the jury listened attentively. The closing arguments summarized the story of a town that had waited patiently for light to return to a shadowed chapter of its history. The jurors deliberated carefully, their decision guided by both science and compassion. When they returned with their verdict, the courtroom was still. The judge asked for the statement to be read aloud. Harold Keene was found responsible for the disappearance of Mara Jensen. June closed her eyes as the words echoed softly through the room. She didn't weep or speak. She just reached for the silver pendant resting in her hand, a pendant now restored, shining faintly under the courtroom lights. Outside, the sky was overcast, but the air felt lighter. Reporters spoke respectfully, their voices calm, their words measured. They told of a case that had taken decades, of technology that had given truth a new language, and of a community that had held onto patience and care even when answers felt far away. In the following months, the Jensen family worked with local organizations to create a scholarship in Mara's name at the nearby high school. It would support young students who wanted to study forensic science, a tribute to the technology and dedication that had finally brought closure. Detective Nora Caldwell returned to her office and packed away the files with quiet satisfaction. She placed a single photograph of Mara on her desk, beside a note that read, "Never forgotten." Caleb Morton, now in his 70s, attended the scholarship ceremony that spring. As students gathered in the school gymnasium, he stood beside June, both watching as the first recipient's name was called. It was a moment of reflection, not of sorrow, but of peace. Years of effort, years of faith, had finally brought a kind of harmony back to Chamberlain. The river flowed quietly once more, and at dusk, the golden light over the water shimmered the way it had on the evening Mara disappeared. Only now, it seemed to carry a message of calm and grace. June often walked to the riverbank where a small memorial bench had been placed. She'd sit there as the sun set, whispering softly, "We found you, my girl. You can rest now." In the years that followed, the case became part of training programs for new detectives in South Dakota. They studied the perseverance that had solved it, the gentle balance between science and heart that guided the team. Nora herself continued mentoring younger officers, teaching them how even the quietest detail might hold the truth if seen with care. And as time moved forward, Chamberlain remained the same small, peaceful town it had always been, its people shaped not by the mystery that once lingered, but by the unity that truth had finally restored. When the wind blew softly across the Missouri River in summer, it carried laughter again, the kind that seemed to belong to everyone, the kind that felt timeless. And in that sound, the story of Mara Jensen lived on, not as a memory of loss, but as a reminder of patience, perseverance, and the grace of truth finally found.